I am Chad Wilson. I usually am in charge of the wingtips for Black River Audubon, but I'm going to step in for Rob tonight. He could not be here, so we've got a great speaker for you, and we'll have a few announcements after he's done that I'll go over. And for now, Larry Wilson, do you want to introduce him?
Well, thanks everybody for coming. Dr. Bort Edwards is the Assistant Curator of Environment at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. He is an evolutionary biologist whose research focuses on the causes, processes, and patterns of species distribution across environments, a critical tool for protecting biodiversity and the health of the planet. Before joining the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, Dr. Edwards serves as an associate research scientist in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Yale University, where he worked on the Map of Life, a global initiative to map the distributions of all known species across the planet. In his new role at the museum, Edwards will develop a research program to understand environmental changes regionally and on a global scale, using the museum's extensive collections and its more than 11,000 acres of natural area preserves in northern Ohio. Dr. Edwards will be speaking about the rich diversity of Ohio flora. Dr. Edwards.
Thank you. All right. We'll get the lights. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. My title of Assistant Curator for the Environment is slightly incongruous. I'm a botanist, but mostly a data botanist these days. So growing up looking at plants in the field, I've now moved into sort of how we understand how plants are distributed through analyzing large data sets. So today I'm going to sort of give us a bit of an introduction into why plants are distributed differently across the landscape, the history of the flora in this part of the world specifically, and some of the research I have been doing and other people have been doing into how what we have now exists, and maybe a little bit into how this helps us understand what is a slightly concerning future. So, species move and change through space, but also through time. So these are the two sort of angles that we're looking at when we're trying to understand what plants and animals are around us today. So if you're in one place, it's different to somewhere else. And if you come back in 100 years' time, 1,000 years' time, it will also be different. So we have two different vectors that we have to try and understand how they work together to understand how what we see around us came to be. So an obvious example, I guess this is sort of simple to follow, but if you were to start a lovely road trip, you've had been given 3 months of holiday leave, you start on the west coast, and you're in beautiful, tall, wet, central rainforest. Big trees, very different plants to what you'd see here in Ohio. You might then cross over the mountains, and so now you're in the rain depressions, the drier parts of the continent. You've suddenly lost all those big trees. You have dry scrub and seasonal ephemeral plants that come up in spring and disappear over the summer. You cross back up into the mountains in the center of the country, Colorado, and you're back into sort of wetter climate. The mountains are attracting rainfall. You have conifer forests and evergreen forests and high alpine meadows. And this is, again, a different environment to what you were just in. If you were to continue moving east, suddenly you leave those forests behind you. You're in the Great Plains and the prairies. Species diversity drops away entirely. There's not as much rain. You have a lot of grasses and very low-growing shrubs and forbs. Very, very different to what you might have just seen in the mountains. And then you come all the way across to the Appalachians. And again, we're back into mountainous country. So we have more rainfall, more elevation, different habitats, and a different range of plants and animals. So for example, here, this is Dolly Sods, which is a beautiful high elevation plateau in the Appalachian Mountains. And it has a flora that's actually more similar to Canada. You get a lot of high alpine species that have come all the way down the mountains to this plateau. And then returning back to Cleveland or Ohio, we've moved back into sort of a mesic forest, your deciduous trees, beeches, elms, oaks. And so just moving through that space from one side of the country to the other, we've come across a whole different range of environments and habitats. But how has that got to be where it is? Why is it that we don't just see one really, really aggressive species that has managed to occupy all that land, and we find a monoculture from one side of the country to the other. And so to do that, we need to look somewhat into the past. So what has got us to this point? And a lot of what we see, certainly here in the Northeast, is that up to about 12 to 18,000 years ago, North America was connected to Asia and Europe through the land bridge. So sea levels were a little lower, the land was a little bit above the sea level, and so there was a transmission of plants and animals backwards and forwards across this land bridge between Asia and Europe and North America. What happened is that as those glacial changes happened, so ice sheets started to come down from the north, we have what we developed as an arc. So the Appalachians were cut off from the rest of Asia. The ice sheet formed a barrier to the rest of the world up to the north. And Appalachia became this sort of refuge for these plants and animals that had previously been shared backwards and forwards across that land bridge. And what's special about those mountains is that you have a diversity of habitats as you go from the bottom of the mountain, from the plains, and then you move up, you get slightly cooler and cooler. The rainfall changes as you move up the mountains. So you have a huge range of potential niches that different species can kind of stack themselves on in those mountains. So one mountain range can hold a lot of those species that had previously come down across that land bridge. So, for example, if you were to go for a walk in the Adirondacks or further south down through the Appalachians, you would find a lot of species that are very similar to those that you would find in Asia because of that shared ancestry. Things that used to be able to communicate across that land bridge are now trapped and isolated on these mountains. So you have gentians, which are more common throughout much of Europe. Rhododendrons and laurels, which are sort of symbolic of lots of parts of Japan and Southeast Asia and China. Their floras look very similar to what you'll find in these parts of the Appalachians. Big glossy leaves, big bright white flowers. And in fact, Australia, where I come from, the gentians are so widespread across Asia and Europe that we find gentians that look quite similar to some of the ones you'll find here in the Appalachians, growing in the high alpine areas of Australia. So these plant groups are distributed all across the world. And again, we have the azaleas and the blueberries which are diverse all throughout Asia and Europe, and azaleas which are center of endemism. Most of the species you'll find in Southeast Asia. That's their heartland and their home, and it's from there that they have actually moved across into North America. Similar with rhododendrons, blueberries, and trillium. And trilliums, again, are well represented outside North America. Just some more pictures. Dogwoods. Dogwoods are iconic and emblematic of Asia as well, and the mountain laurels. So there's this strong connection and influence of the rest of the world, or at least Asia and Europe, on the flora of this part of northeast US. And in fact, if we have a look at the relationships between plants, if we look at very close relatives, so a sister species, you have one species, and where would you find the next closely related species? That's the top map up there. And you can see that a fair number are represented. The size of the circles is how many species are that closest relative to species that we find in Northeast America. So the purple circle there is a species that you find in the Appalachians, its next closest sister is also found in northeast the US. So its relatives are all close to home. A lot of those are found for those sister relationships. But you are still well represented for Asia as well. A lot of species in northeast US, their closest sister relative is found across in Northeast Asia, in Southeast Asia. Almost half the plants. If you look a little deeper back in time, so maybe not the closest sister, but a species that's slightly more distantly related, that's the second map here. And you can see that suddenly Asia is hugely predominant, and Europe starts to become a factor as well. So those deeper relationships are what we're really seeing. So that represents the fact that that separation between Asia and Northeast US was sort of backwards in time. It's those older, deeper relationships that are really strong. And then as we move closer in time, that top graph there, the relationships become a little bit more close to home. But that really shows that there's a lot of a diversity that we see here. A lot of the species are shared with other parts of the world. So it's a cosmopolitan assemblage of plants. And this is just showing, this is the ice sheet that moved down from the north about 18,000 years ago, and then it started to retreat about 12 or 11,000 years ago, and that's what cut off that communication between Asia and North America. But there are certain parts of what was not glaciated, what was not ice, that were like refuges. So areas of habitat, of environment that were friendly to the plants that already existed here, and that sort of acted as arks or refugia to the plants that were there already. And in particular, we have the Ozarkian refuge, which is sort of in the center there, just north of Texas. It was a mesic, wet, but warm enough to sort of support some of those species that had retreated from the ice. And also the Alleghenian refuge. So that was just above the Florida panhandle there. Another area where lots of species were able to sort of tread water almost to shelter from that ice that had come down from the north and sort of bide their time waiting to re-expand out north. And re-expand they did. So you can see sort of Ohio up there. As the ice retreated north, these species from these refuges started to re-expand as that environment became more hospitable again. So they had been sitting in these patches, evolving and maybe speciating, becoming slightly different from each other. And now that they were given this opportunity, they were able to move back out and start to sort of re-inhabit the rest of the continent. So we have this Alleghenian flora has started to move up from the southeast. We have the Ozarkian flora, which is starting to move from the central south and push up northwards as well. It's following that temperature as it gets warmer, moving north as the ice recedes. These plants start to move up with it. And then we also had, as that ice has retreated, some of the boreal elements. So your conifers and the sort of Canadian flora that had started to come back down south to occupy the areas that had been covered in ice in Ohio. So all those glacial plains and moraines and tills, some of those conifer forests have started to move down from the north. So where we are here is really sort of at the crossroads of a whole three-pronged attack almost of plants that are moving and striving to sort of occupy this space that's been left free with the retreating ice. And as you can see, the map underlying this is a map of the diversity of vascular plants in the US, in the contiguous US. And the mountains there, the Appalachians, still retain a lot of that diversity that they harbored during the glacial period, during the Ice Age. But you can see how there's also some darker green lines there that move up through Ohio, up through the northeast, that represents where these different groups of plants are starting to almost come together. So if you can imagine, you have this three-pronged attack and they're going to start overlapping at some point. And that's kind of where we sit now. We have really high species diversity in California, which kind of makes everything else look a little insignificant. We have really low species diversity in the Central Plains. But we do have this sort of high assembly mixture, admixture of plants in the northeast here that is quite special in terms of where it's come from and what we have. And we can represent this by drawing lines on the map where the edge of a lot of species ranges happen. So you can imagine that these species are kind of like marching out across the landscape, and they'll reach a point where they can't go any further north or they can't go any further east or west because the climate's not right for them. And for a number of these species, that point is sort of the same. So you'll have types of forests, that plants that like to grow together, that all sort of have reached the same point in the landscape where that's the edge of their range. And each one of these lines represents sort of boundary lines where whole groups of plants have reached and have sort of come to a stop, or are at least currently suspended. And it's hard to see on this map, I apologize, but you can see up where we are, sort of the northeast here, we have a whole mess of lines. There's red, which sort of indicates a north-south sort of barrier. And we have blue lines, which is more of an east-west sort of edge line. And there's a whole tangle of lines up in that sort of Northeast Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York. And so we have this sort of really fascinating coming together of these different groups of plants right here.
There's a laser pointer.
Oh.
That orange button.
Thank you. All right. And so that is part of what has contributed to the diversity in this part of the world. It's that we have these old elements that have been shunted around by the climate in the past, and they're now trying to recolonize an area, and they're all coming together and providing this sort of melting pot of different plants and habitats. And I'm sure you guys are probably way more familiar with than me that you can drive to the lakefront and the lakeshore and find a whole different habitat, bog habitats, that's completely different to the foothills of the Appalachians or to the plains to the south or to some of the glacial lakes and ponds that you see around. So we have this great mix of plants and animals. So that's the past. And that feeds directly into the present. But I sort of thought I'd take a little bit of a detour into how we actually study plants in the present. And I apologize if this is all old news to anybody, but the role of the museum, of the Cleveland Natural History Museum and museums and universities around the world is as sort of like a library and a repository for biological knowledge and objects. And when you come to the museum, unless you're lucky enough to come behind the scenes, and please call me if you are at the museum and I will take you behind the scenes. But we can show you a tiny little fraction. But most of what is important to us in a museum is out of sight downstairs, and that is the scientific collections that we have. So in the herbarium, which is where I work with my plants, we have about 76,000 specimens. So that is representing almost 10,000 species. So this is the work of hundreds, maybe even thousands of collectors over hundreds of years. Our oldest collection goes back to 1725. We've inherited from someone else's collection. And it's hours and hours of researchers and travelers and volunteers traveling around the country and around the globe and collecting plants and sending them back to Cleveland that we can then incorporate and look after and keep as a record for what was growing in different places around the world at different times. It's like a time capsule and a library of the history of biology on Earth. So, again, for those not familiar, we go out into the field and we find a plant that looks kind of nice or that we're interested in collecting or something that someone else has told us they'd like us to collect because they're studying it. And in the same way that you might put a four-leaf clover on a page of a book and press it flat and dry it so that you can keep it forever, we take our specimen, we put it on a piece of newspaper, and then we put it in between some pieces of cardboard, and then we strap it really tightly so that it squeezes it flat, and that way we can transport it back to the herbarium, where we dry it out, and we have a nice flat specimen that we can mount on pieces of paper, like this. So each of these is a different specimen, a different species that someone has collected. Down here is the collection information. So that is the reason to collect these plants. This tells us who collected it, when they collected it, and where they collected it. And if they were really nice people, they'd also tell us what the environment was like, what else it was growing with. And that there is the data that, as scientists, we want to know so that we can understand what was this environment like when this person was here. So maybe this was 50 years ago, somewhere that we can't go now, or somewhere that doesn't exist. Maybe there's a strip mall where this plant was collected, and that is the only way that we will know that that plant grew there, is because we have this record in our herbarium. You can't go back in time and find that plant. It's gone. And, for example, this here is upside down. I don't know why the person who mounted this mounted it upside down, but they did. And if you're gymnastical, you can turn yourself upside down and see that as a lady's slipper orchid. And that was collected by someone who worked at Lake Erie College, and it was in 1892. So that plant there, if you went there, that probably doesn't exist anymore. We will never be able to find that population of plants ever again. This is the record that we have of what grew there and when. And this is duplicated over and over again. So we have these specimens that we put in folders, and we stack the folders in shelves like a library, and they can sit there for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years without anybody paying much attention to them until someone suddenly decides that that's the plant they want to study, or that's the piece of data that they want to pull out of the collection. So stacks and stacks of just information sitting there. And that's sort of how the rows go back. And just again, if anybody hasn't seen a herbarium, it's not that exciting, but that is our reason to be. That represents those hundreds of thousands of people hours and blood, sweat, and tears. But for me, that's great, and that is really valuable, but what I'm really interested in is that data that was on the labels. So it's great to be able to look at a plant on a piece of paper, but I'm interested in how many plants. I'm interested in the diversity of the landscape. So I really want something to be able to go through and scour all that information out so I can put together a big data set and just look at where did all these plants come from at once. And so luckily, digitization has been going on in many herbaria for many years now, and that luckily includes the Natural History Museum in Cleveland. And so we have a database where each row represents one of those specimens on a piece of paper. It has a unique number. It tells me who collected it, where they collected it, when they collected it, and hopefully what the environment was like where they collected it. And so, as I said, we have about 76,000 specimens, which is decent for the size of a museum that we are. For context, though, the Smithsonian has about 5 million species. So we are still sort of small, but we represent a very important sort of regional hub of a much larger picture. As you can see, our specimens here are very quite strongly clustered around Cleveland, but we do have pretty good representation. So of that 76,000, the vast majority are from the US, which makes a degree of sense. We inherited a collection from somebody from Germany for reasons unknown, but we have a lot of collections from Germany, Canada, Mexico, England, Austria as well. New Zealand, we have 32 specimens, which really, as an Australian, really bothered me because we only have 6 specimens from Australia. Turns out that the museum actually sent a ship on a field trip to New Zealand in the 1960s, I believe, and so they collected a whole bunch of plants. I'm determined to change this and turn this around, but at this point we're still being outgunned. But as you can see, if you were to look at those specimens that we have reliable spatial data for, so for a lot of these specimens that were collected in maybe the 1800s or even up to maybe 1970, often a collector would say, collected in North America, which is really not particularly helpful to me. If I want to put that point on a map, that means I'm putting a point in the middle of the US, which doesn't really tell me where it's actually coming from. If we're lucky, it might tell me the state it was collected in. Sometimes they'll give a county, but counties have often changed since the 1800s or even the early 1900s. If I'm even luckier, they might have given a written description, which is 2 miles from the pump at the siding for some railway, and we can go backwards and look at maps and try and work out where that point was. But the gold standard for us is for collections that have been made with a GPS unit. And that will give us a latitude and longitude. And those are the records for what we have in the herbarium that have those GPS records. And that's about 4,250 species. So those are plant specimens that I can take their data and plot it directly on a map. And now we're starting to get to the point where I can start to ask questions about what grows where with some degree of accuracy. This is just zooming in to show that there is a huge cluster around sort of Cuyahoga County, and that's botanists are lazy. We don't like to go too far unless we're hunting something really special. So if we're going out for a trip for the day, we're typically going to drive out and back, so our geography is often a little bit limited. And this is just showing that same data again, just as a heat map. So really well represented around sort of the Cleveland area where the museum is, with some sort of coverage up through the northeast as well. But that data that I showed you, that spreadsheet of records from just the Cleveland Natural History Museum, that sort of data is being replicated by museums and herbaria and universities around the world. So the data that I have, I will upload into a central database called GBIF here. And it will also take records from iDigBio, which if some of you are citizen scientists or go out and mark plants and animals that you see in the field, that data goes into iDigBio and it gets fed into GBIF. And so all these data hubs here around the world are all putting their data and their information into big central repositories effectively in the cloud. So now what I had was just this little collection of points around Cleveland and Ohio suddenly becomes all the data from every herbarium and museum around the world. And now it's becoming really powerful because a lot of those collections, they will have collected from overseas. Some of them will be from Ohio. The Smithsonian, for instance, will have a whole lot of collections that we don't have, but that are from Ohio. So I can start to fill in those gaps using the records from other institutions. And so what I had been doing for some of my work up until recently was to look at the diversity of daisy species in North America. So by accessing that big central data repository, I can pull down the localities, the GPS localities for all the records of daisy species in North America. And even after cleaning out records that were badly labeled or had errors in them, that gives me almost 500,000 different records. That's 500,000 localities where we can say this species grows or grew here. And that covers about 3,000 species. And we were interested in daisies because daisies are stupidly diverse. They're about 10% of North America's flowering plants. So if you walk outside and pick up 10 plants, chances are, in fact, around here, chances are more than one of those is a daisy. But daisies are incredibly diverse, and we don't really know why. And so our question was to use this data to try and start to get an understanding for maybe why there are so many daisies, or at least why they grow where they grow. And it's these big data sets that allow me to do that. So we can take all those points and we can sort of melt them down into grid cells. We can say, of those points, how many are in every 100 kilometers squared, say. And that's what this map shows here. So each grid cell, each square here is 100 kilometers squared. And apologies for colorblind people, I need to redo my maps. But we have a red blob here, which shows very high diversity. A couple more high diversity spots here. And again, we've got the Appalachians popping up here with some sort of intermediate diversity. And the rest of the country is sort of fairly low. But this is showing us that daisies aren't evenly distributed. So that 1 in 10 plants might actually be more over here. You might find 8 out of 10 plants over here as a daisy, and maybe fewer through here. Or maybe just plant diversity is lower here in general, and that 1 in 10 holds everywhere. But for whatever reason, we find we have this really high number or richness of daisy species in this part of the country. So why is this so? The other great thing that we have access to are maps of the environment. So we can go and ask what the pH is for any one of those points on the map. Or we could ask what the soil calcium is for any point on the map. Or what the coldest temperature is every year, or the warmest temperature, or maybe what the rainfall is, or any one of about 240 different variables. So we accumulated all this data, 240 variables, tried to weed out those that were not relevant and useful. And we had this idea that maybe plants were avoiding areas that weren't very hospitable. So say you have pH that's really high. Let's take a guess and say that's probably not where most plants are going to want to grow. If you have somewhere that's really, really hot in the middle of summer, maybe fewer plants are going to be well adapted to grow there. Or if it's really, really cold, or if it's really high calcium, and so we're back to all those variables. And so what we did was we took the top 5%, the most extreme 5% of every one of those variables, and plotted them on the map, and then we stacked them on top of each other, and we came up with this map. And so this shows where is it most extreme. So these hot areas on the map are where you have the hottest, the most pH, the most calcium, the most salt, or the coldest variables all on top of each other. So these are really inhospitable places. These are places where if you want to grow there, you don't have to be well adapted to one extreme. You have to be really well adapted to 3 or 5 or 8 extremes. And as a plant or an animal, that's not easy. And so, again, we assumed that if this was true, if these areas are really inhospitable, we would expect there to be fewer plants there, less diversity of plants. And we could test this. So we have our daisy map that shows us where the most species of daisy grow, and we have our map of where the most inhospitable areas are. And you can see we're already starting to get into a little bit of trouble. This is looking like it might almost line up a little bit, which is a little bit odd. But what we can do is we can take a value, an exact value for the number of daisy species that grow in a grid cell there, and the number of extreme variables for the same grid cell over here, and we can ask what the correlation is. So, across the bottom here is how many of those variables are extreme for any grid cell. So down here we have no variables are extreme, and up here we have 6 of those variables are extreme in one location. And going up here, this is for all North American plants, we see that diversity actually is quite low where there is no extremeness, which is kind of puzzling. In fact, it goes up as you get towards more extreme environments and then crashes right at the very end. And this was unexpected until we looked at just those plants that were not daisies. So we subtracted daisies from all the flowering plants and we reran the analysis. And suddenly we see that there is a little bit of an increase, a bit of a hump here, but really, as extremeness increases, the number of plants that want to grow there that aren't daisies doesn't change an awful lot. There's not a great driver of diversity there. So what happened to the rest of that graph? If you just plot daisies, they're the ones that are driving that pattern. So as your environment becomes more extreme, as it becomes less what we thought was hospitable, daisies are actually volunteering to be there, or at least have found a way to be there. And not only have they found a way to be there, but they've thrived there because there's lots of different species. So something about being a daisy has allowed them to grow in these really difficult, dicey situations. And I'm sorry about this. This is a messy graph. But this is the evolutionary tree of all those daisies. So the ancestor would be back here, and all these tips up here, the ends of these branches, are the species that we currently see. And they're divided into tribes, groups within the daisy family. And we asked, using some analysis programs, of those variables that we were looking at, which most likely explain where they grow. So these groups, what is it that they're seeking out effectively? What is it that they seem to be looking for, or at least tolerating really well? And we found that on average, or sort of across the board, it seems to be a lot of these, and forgive me, there's a lot of words here that don't mean a lot even to me now, this is a couple of years, but a lot of soil chemistry. So we have phosphorus and cation exchange, which is how sort of part of the pH system. We have some temperature variables, but we have feldspar and aluminium and clays and lithium. So it seems to be that what is allowing daisies to grow in a lot of these places is that they have somehow managed to crack something of a code in the soil that they're growing in. They're able to at least tolerate these soils, and that has allowed them to diversify and spread and to adapt to these really difficult situations. Abiotic environmental variables, so clays and soils and things, not competition with other plants and animals, seems to be what's driving this diversity. So that was sort of just a dive into the sorts of things that we can do with data in the present and how we can ask questions about how and where plants are distributed across the landscape in the present using these big data sets. But we all know, I hope it's not a controversial idea to float here, that the world is changing right now, has been changing for a while, and it looks like it's going to continue changing, and not in a good way. And so we have a future to deal with, and we have a future to deal with that's not going to be easy for us or for the plants and animals that we share the planet with. The temperature is increasing and has been for a good 40 years or so. And with that comes changes in the weather. I think walking outside today, it certainly feels to me like it's a little bit unusual. Europe is currently sweltering under record temperatures across large swathes of it. So we've gone from freezing temperatures a couple of weeks ago to hot temperatures now. And this is symptomatic of what we expect with a climate that is in confusion, really. So we have airstreams that are starting to not work in the ways that we're used to. And so if we are to understand how plants and animals are going to be in the future, we need to put that in the context of a changing environment. And so we can take the sorts of analyses and lessons that we were learning with daisies in the present and try and use that to look at how things might change in the future. So we know that species are mobile from what we saw at the very beginning, that over time species have moved. So they've come down from Asia into North America, they've moved south and formed refugia as the ice sheets have come down, and then when those ice sheets have moved back up, the plants have started to move back up to fill that space. We know they're capable of moving, and we know that as we currently expect, plants will have to start to move north as the temperature on average increases. So if you're trying to grow as a plant in Phoenix, Arizona right now, you're definitely eyeing off somewhere north to move to if you could get up and walk, because it's becoming incredibly difficult to grow down there. And we are seeing this already in the species ranges changing. We have plants and animals, we have pests in particular that are really good at moving around that we are starting to see move. So things like woolly adelgid, part of their expansion across hemlocks is probably partly to do with changes in the climate that allows them to move out into the population. And if we look at a model, and this is a projection for how mammals, birds, and amphibians are expected to be responding to climate change over the next 50 years. And so this is agnostic to the habitat that they would be moving through. This is purely, if they're looking for a path of least resistance to move from, the species that we expect to move, where are they going to go? And it's mesmerizing, it's beautiful to look at, but it's terrifying as well. Because it's this mass exodus of animals, particularly over here, birds and amphibians that are pushing up that Appalachian, that very sort of refuge that had kept them safe 18 to 12,000 years ago. They're using that very same path again to try and escape up the east coast. Because in the same way that was a climatic refuge when the glaciers were moving down, that's now a climatic refuge as the world warms around them. Those mountains are going to remain that little bit cooler for that little bit longer and act as almost a highway for them to move up the country. And this, for us in Ohio, means that we are on the fringes of this mass movement of animals as they try and escape. And so we can ask, looking at the habitat, that we know that these animals, or plants in this case, this is looking at trees now, where do we expect these trees to be able to survive into the future? So this is taking the environment and modeling it into the future and asking, if I'm a tree growing in this location now, where do I want to be growing 50 years into the future? And you can see again, we have this east coast, this Appalachian arc that is emerging again, this refuge for these plants, and it spills across into Ohio, into the Great Lakes area. And so we are going to be smack bang in the middle of this pathway, of this sort of refuge for plants, animals, as they try and escape north. And part of the issue with plants and animals and humans is that we don't get along very well. And in the same way that plants and animals are going to want to move here because the climate's going to be nicer, humans are going to want to move here as well. If you desire a nice beachfront property, the coastlines are going to start being eaten away, are going to start disappearing. You're going to start eyeing off the Great Lakes as a really nice place to set up camp. If anybody here is into real estate, you probably know this already, but buy on the lakefront, because that is going to be hugely valuable in the future. That is going to be prime real estate for everybody trying to get away from the coast. Not only that, but agriculture is going to want to move here as well. The Great Lakes hold a huge proportion of the world's fresh water. California is already struggling and sweltering under really difficult conditions for food. And it's not going to be long until that food bowl that exists down here either shifts up to the Great Lakes and this area up here, Or maybe even worse, they start trying to pump the water out of the lakes down to the west coast. So we're going to be fighting humans trying to move to this part of the world. We're going to be fighting agriculture moving to this part of the world. And at the same time, we're going to have plants and animals that can't advocate for themselves trying to move to this part of the world. So that is our challenge going forward, is how can we understand the environment in the future in the best way to try and protect what we have now and what we expect to arrive on our doorstep in the next 4, 5, or 6 decades. And so this part of the world is a really important part of that. We hold and we protect sort of a refuge, another refuge in the future of our planet in that sense. Okay. And just as one example, this is something that I'm sort of working on at the moment as the sort of germ of an idea of a project. And that is that we want to sort of find plants that we think might start to show the signs of moving in the near future. So plants already live in Ohio, but what are the plants that we expect to move north as the climate changes? And mistletoe is actually a really good indicator of this. And it was so lovely and warm over New Year's that I drove down to Portsmouth in southern Ohio, right on the border with Kentucky, and collected my first ever collection of American mistletoe, and the first collection of American mistletoe in the Cleveland Natural History Museum from Ohio. And the reason that there aren't that many collections, or that was the first collection, is that mistletoe shows this really strong north-south divide. And this is classic of what we're looking for if we're looking for species that might start to move north. So this is a climate barrier. So the temperatures, either the coldest temperature in winter or maybe the hottest temperature in summer, is preventing this species from growing further north. It's found its line here and it's stopped. But if the temperature starts to change and it starts to get too hot down here, it starts to get warmer here, we would expect this to start to shift northwards. And this is just showing you the blow-up of, this is the Ohio River here, and these are the 4 specimens in the world that have been collected in Ohio, none of which we have in our museum. But what we'd expect is that these few populations here, as it starts to warm, they will start to occupy territory further north. And what's really cool about mistletoe is that it's really easy to see. So in winter, you can drive along and all the trees have lost their leaves and you can spot mistletoe in the trees. And for a survey, that's a fantastic thing to have. But also they're bird dispersed. So birds eat their seeds, which are sticky, and they pass through their gut and they come out the other end sticky, and they stick to the tree that the bird is sitting on. And this is great because it means that if the temperature starts to change and the climate gets more favourable further north, the plant isn't relying on wind or water or runners to move itself to follow the climate. It's going to go with birds, and birds are really good at moving. So we should be able to see mistletoe moving north almost as quickly as it's able to. No doubt those seeds are already being deposited on trees further north, but just aren't surviving. So we would expect them to start growing into mistletoe as soon as those conditions become right. So this is a project that I'm hoping to get up, and I don't know, I suspect none of you live in southern Ohio, but if you do, this is a project where we're going to be hoping for some community engagement to try and discover the populations and plot the populations so that we know where these plants are now, so that we can then plot any changes in the future. But, as I said, one of the things we have to contend with is that land use is going to change. So humans are going to want to move into Ohio in a greater rate as well. And so this is a map of Cleveland and east from 2006. And it shows, again, I apologize for anybody who's red-green colorblind. I didn't realize until I put my slides together that I should have made different colors. But we have red here is showing area that is agricultural or urban or has had humans stomping all over it and tearing it up. This is developed areas. Green is the natural area with minimal modification, so reserves or corridors beside roads sometimes or besides rivers. we can project from growth of the city in the past into the future, and this depends on a lot of factors, so it's not going to be perfect. But we can see that if we project to 2100, the undisturbed areas, these green patches, have shrunk considerably. The city and the associated farmland and agriculture and industry has pushed out immensely from what we even have now. And if you subtract one from the other, this is just showing the grey here is what currently is disturbed or urbanised, the green is what's natural, and anything white here is what is expected to become disturbed, to become urbanised or agricultural in the next, 80 years' time. So this is something that we have to contend with. If we want that mistletoe to be able to march slowly forwards, we have to try and understand what areas we can and need to preserve so that it has somewhere to be when it arrives. And part of the museum's mission in that is that we have 66 natural areas that are plots of land that we have purchased and acquired. My predecessor, Jim Bissell, who I'm sure some of you know, was an amazing force in conservation and botany in the area, and he sort of brought together this amazing collection of preserves. And it's through these that we hope that we can sort of maybe hold on to some of the diversity that we know is there. Jim selected sites that he knew were biologically diverse and important. And then you roll that into the metro parks and the national park and the regional parks, and we have the framework for something that we can start to sort of build on to try and protect the areas that we're going to need to protect in the future. So this is something that I think we all need to be proud of as a community, but also something that we need to make sure we look after and treasure and help to maintain as well. And I'm sure a lot of you are involved in some way or other with the activities of the metro parks or the museum's properties. We have weeds that we need to keep down. We have surveys that we need to do. And those are the sorts of activities that we're going to need to do going forward just to keep a hold of what we have now. Oops. And it really is worth protecting. So these are all areas that are currently under the museum's Natural Areas program. We have a lot of sort of bog and lakefront sort of areas because those are habitats that are traditionally taken away, have been turned into housing or marinas or industrial waterfronts. But we have some other of the ledges and the riversides as well. And our hope is that by taking what we have, that data that I showed you before that we have sort of trapped away in the herbarium, in the mammal collection, in the insect collection, we can use that to try and understand what we have in these natural areas now, and then what we can have in the future. So I think that's something that hopefully we can all agree is a worthy cause. And I know all of you are biologically minded, so I think that's something we all do hope happens. And so I don't think it's all entirely doom and gloom. We know the world is changing and going to change, but there is a lot we can do by just looking after what we have to try and to protect what we have and plan for a better future. And I'll take any questions. Yeah. Yes.
But the permafrost is melting too.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. We're in all sorts of trouble. And the permafrost is melting, our coastlines are disappearing, our air quality is not improving as fast as it should. And honestly, what I didn't mention, and I'm trying to get my head around, is we still don't really know what's going to happen to the Great Lakes themselves. We have really bad models of, as the climate changes, is there going to be more rainfall or the lake's going to rise? It is possible the lakes rise. My advice to buy lakefront property, asterisk, because it's possible that there will be more rainfall in this part of the world and the lakes will actually rise as well.
That's actually happened recently. Lake Erie rose 3 feet about 7 years ago.
Yeah.
It still hasn't come back down.
Yeah. And our models for as the lake rises, I mean, in theory, lakes should be okay because there's an outlet, right? It's not like the oceans where they can only go to another ocean. In theory, the lakes can drain out, but if they can't drain out as fast as they're filling up, or if we don't let them drain out as fast as they're filling up, then that could change the whole ecosystem in the Great Lakes as well. And then also, how are we going to deal with the water? Again, if we start pumping that water out of the lake, then all bets are off. So yeah, we're in a mess of trouble. But there is hope. I think there is hope. Yeah. Yes.
So you're saying plants are moving north rather than going extinct?
So that's an excellent, yes. So plants are going north rather than going extinct. I wish that sounds so lovely. We can predict plants moving north. It's harder to predict which of those will go extinct, and they absolutely will. Yes. There are some of those plants, so those models are showing refugia and movement, assuming there's nothing in the way. And that comes back to those maps of human interference, is that if those refuges, if those habitats that they're trying to get to don't exist anymore, then you're absolutely right. That plant or animal is gone. And we've seen that with the monarch butterfly. We're messing with that in a way that we're getting to the point where monarchs are unrecoverable. So in the same way that species are going to start moving north, but they might be death marching. They're marching to somewhere that doesn't exist. And monarch butterflies are the same. They're migrating to places that don't exist anymore. So our best understanding at the moment is still trying to wrap our head around, in an ideal landscape, where can these species go? But you're absolutely right. A lot of these species have nowhere to go anymore. And we are losing species at a rapidly increasing rate. And it can be, from Australia, the fires in Australia 3 or 4 years ago, the koala, which was already endangered, it was sort of limited in where it lived, those fires were enough that it is now functionally extinct. So that means that it exists as an animal, it's alive, but there is almost no hope that it will exist in the future because it's so poor, there's so little diversity in genetics and in its populations that it's walked off the edge of the cliff. It just hasn't fallen yet. So like the roadrunner, it's run out, and it's about to look down. So we have a lot of species like that at the moment where they're already too far gone, but we don't know it yet. So, yeah. Sorry, if you wanted an uplifting talk, maybe not. It is hard to get out of bed some days. Yes.
Part of what your work probably, even you may not want to admit it, involves politics.
Oh, yeah.
Because the two maps that showed the red growing.
Yep.
Lorain County is growing by leaps and bounds. The agriculture area, or undeveloped areas, especially up in Avon and the eastern part of the county. So what efforts are underway to encourage political leaders, mayors, county commissioners, whatever, to understand this? So rather than competing, for example, Avon got Bendix on nice undeveloped land, took it from Illyria. Illyria is stuck, and instead of cooperating, they're taking from each other.
Yeah.
Or building new houses from each other. You know, people coming out of Cuyahoga County, coming to Lorain County or Lake County or whatever.
Yep.
So how do you explain that to the political leaders that they can't be competing in this way? They have to cooperate.
Do you have a good idea?
Well, I think it's people organizing and getting out there and going to council meetings, et cetera.
I think,
we go to city council meetings in Avon, for example, and NIMBY, but in Westlake they might not care.
Yes. So. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So, I mean, full disclosure, the reason I showed work on species modeling and daisy diversity is because I have navigated my career to avoid political issues. I find as soon as you bring people and politics into the question, suddenly the science starts to become secondary, and I hate that with passion. So I'm an evolutionary biologist. I don't care about your housing problem. Well, I do care about housing. That's a different matter. But I like the pure biology. But with this work now, yes, this is something I'm having to start to think about, and I haven't got deeply enough into it that I have a good understanding of what solutions might be out there. But I think you've nailed it in that if we don't care, then the politicians aren't going to care. So if we aren't going out there and nudging and pushing every single day, what incentive do they have to take notice of anything? So it is up to us. And we, as the sort of scientifically, biologically literate people, can see what's coming down the pike. Unfortunately, I think that big groundswell of pressure is going to be too late. In the same way that the Roadrunner has run out over the edge of the cliff already, I think a lot of people are going to wake up way too late that we are in trouble. But for us that hopefully understand this, I think, yeah, you're right. We need to be the ones who are pushing every single day in every way we can. But it's not easy and it's not guaranteed success. And I don't know, smarter people than me are definitely working on it. And they're the people I need to talk to. And hopefully, so the museum at the moment is sort of embarking on a new initiative to try and have a long-term plan for our research and put it in the context of environment change. And part of that will be reaching out to people who you probably know who I don't, who can help with that sort of thing. So I am absolutely open to any networking or suggestions of how we should be, working together because, yeah, that's what we need to do. Yeah. No? Yes.
You mentioned 3 data repositories earlier in the presentation. There's an app on the phone called iNaturalist. Does that feed into one of those, or is that separate?
Yes, it does. So iNaturalist it's amazing because anybody can use it. There is a quality concern there to some extent because anybody can pick up their phone and point it at something and maybe get something that's in the ballpark but not correct. So when I'm downloading that data and I'm not going to go through every single of 500,000 data points and be like, yep, nope, yep. So there is a little less wiggle room there.
Now, they do have to be double-checked. They have to
Yes.
be confirmed 3 times to be considered useful for science.
Correct. So they have checks in place. So they have to be vetted. Not always perfect. I mean, when you're looking at daisies, damn yellow compositae, like half of them look the same. And if the picture's not great, that's then flagged. So they have a workflow to try and sort out some of those worst records. And herbarium collections aren't like, even the experts aren't great at this either. I mean, if we're collecting plants we aren't familiar with, we'll be like, kind of looks like that. So, yeah. iNaturalist is fantastic. It comes with other issues as well in that, a bit like botanists being lazy, you'll get a lot of observations in like car parks and beside the road. But again, if you can account for that, it's an incredibly valuable resource. So yeah, if none of you are familiar with iNaturalist, it is an app you can get on your phone and it will help you identify a plant or an animal in front of you. And then that observation is recorded and served into those big data sets that we are using to try and, understand the world. So even if it's a couple of data points a year, if that's a couple of million people, that's a lot of data. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Is that the most useful one on the phone, or is there another one that's...
I think, yes, iNaturalist is the most active and probably the most comprehensive.
Thank you.
Yep. No, you're welcome. Yes.
You were talking about species moving north as it warms, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about the difference between warming and extreme events,
Yep.
because it's not just a matter of...
Absolutely not.
It's
No. And I think that ties a little bit into the koalas problem, is that koalas were already in trouble. So you imagine that they're already having to find new places to live, and then a fire comes through and wipes out those populations. So you're right, there's at least two layers to that. We have a general trend of warming, which is going to slowly start pushing everything north, and then you get minus 41 week and 70 the next, which a lot of plants and a lot of animals aren't going to deal with that well. Like if you're freezing one week and then having to deal with heat stress for some of them the next week, then you're right, it's 2 layers. And so the models that we're working with, those models that predict where plants and animals might need to go, they're good, but it's really hard to factor in cataclysmic random events. So yeah, what we're predicting here is in some ways a best case scenario, and we're going to lose some stuff along the way just for things we can't predict. Yeah, those cataclysmic events are coming. Yeah.
Is it, I don't know if this is a dumb question, but are species going extinct faster now that the climate is warming? Is there data on that?
There is, yes. So there was some insect data that came out maybe 2 years ago that showed that not only are insect numbers decreasing by 30 to 70% in some places, but species are disappearing as well. And I don't have a number on a proportion. We don't even know how many species we have on Earth, but we do know that we are losing more every year. Yeah. Like my postdoc at Yale, where the Map of Life, we had experts who worked on plants and bats and grasshoppers and ants and birds and mammals, and we'd all sit around the table and we'd look at each other and we're like, we're screwed. Because we're getting this data in that's showing all those groups of animals and plants are the numbers of endangered and threatened species is just ticking up in every single group. And it's a difficult feeling. Yeah. Again, sorry to be a downer. Yeah.
I think, in relation to his question, I think that they're saying it's like 1,000 times faster than the background extinction rate
Yep.
of recorded history, 1,000 times faster than
Wow. Thank you for that. That's worse than I would have. Yeah. So yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. And again, where we don't often know how bad it is until it's happened. Like, it's this things are already in motion now. That 1,000 rate might be an underestimate just because we're still trying to collect data of what's happening this year, because we don't have that yet. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, this is.
Sorry, my hearing's bad. I'm going to come to you.
It show how ignorant I am of technology, but what is that little thing glowing there on your neckline? On your neck.
Oh, here. This is a microphone for the camera. I'm scanning your retinas and.
You're an awesome speaker, Nick.
All right.
No,
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you. That was super great. That was really good.